When I walked into the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel for my family's annual charity gala, an elegant event that had been organized for the past 15 years to raise money for children's hospitals, while also serving as an opportunity for our wealthy relatives to demonstrate their philanthropic commitment and social status within the exclusive circles where reputation and charitable giving were measures of success and respectability, I immediately noticed that something was wrong with the massive family portrait that had been commissioned 3 years earlier, and that normally served as the centerpiece display for these gatherings, where our family's history and achievements were celebrated and honored through formal recognition and carefully orchestrated presentations. The oil painting that had cost over $50,000 and had been created by one of the city's most renowned portrait artists was still hanging in its place of honor above the main entrance where guests would see it immediately upon arriving for the evening's festivities. But my face had been completely erased from the composition and painted over with background scenery that made it appear as if I had never been part of the family group that had posed for hours during multiple sessions. To create this masterpiece that was supposed to represent our unity and shared heritage for future generations to admire and understand. The shock of seeing myself literally removed from the family history that was being displayed to over 300 prominent guests who had paid thousands of dollars to attend this exclusive event was devastating enough. But the casual way that my relatives were mingling and socializing around the altered portrait as if nothing had changed revealed the depth of their commitment to erasing me from the family narrative and pretending that my contributions and very existence were so insignificant that they could be deleted without anyone noticing or caring about the deliberate act of historical revision that had been orchestrated to punish me for choices and revelations that had threatened their carefully maintained facade of respectability and conventional success. What they didn't realize as they celebrated their charitable generosity and social prominence while surrounded by a portrait that had been altered to exclude me was that their act of erasure had finally given me the motivation and clarity I needed to stop protecting their secrets and maintaining the silence that had allowed them to build their reputations and financial success on foundations of lies, corruption, and criminal activity that would be exposed when I stood up during the evening's program and revealed not only my true name and identity, but also the detailed knowledge I possessed about their illegal business practices, and the evidence I had been collecting for years, while waiting for the right moment to bring justice to people who had used their wealth and social status to exploit others, while hiding behind masks of philanthropy and community service. The family portrait that had been defaced to remove my presence had been commissioned during happier times, when my relationship with my relatives was still characterized by the kind of surface-level civility and mutual tolerance that had enabled us to maintain connections despite fundamental disagreements about values, priorities, and the ethical boundaries that should govern both personal relationships and business practices that affected countless employees, customers, and community members, whose lives were impacted by decisions made in corporate boardrooms and family meetings where profit and power took precedence over human welfare and social responsibility. The original portrait had captured all 12 members of our extended family in formal poses that conveyed dignity, prosperity, and the kind of generational continuity that wealthy families use to establish their legitimacy and importance within social hierarchies that value inherited status and accumulated wealth over individual merit and authentic achievement that requires genuine effort and moral integrity, rather than simply being born into circumstances that provide advantages and opportunities unavailable to most people. The 3 years that had passed since the portrait was painted had been marked by increasing tension and conflict within our family, as I had begun to question and challenge business practices and personal behaviors that I found morally objectionable and potentially criminal, creating friction with relatives who preferred to maintain the status quo and avoid uncomfortable conversations about the sources of their wealth and the methods they used to maintain their competitive advantages in industries where ethical behavior and legal compliance were often viewed as obstacles to maximum profitability and market dominance. My growing unwillingness to participate in family activities and business ventures that I considered morally compromised had been met with increasing hostility and attempts to marginalize my influence and exclude me from decision-making processes that might have been affected by my insistence on ethical standards and legal compliance that other family members viewed as naive idealism that would interfere with practical business operations and profit maximization strategies. The breaking point in our family relationships had occurred 6 months earlier, when I had threatened to expose evidence of tax evasion, labor law violations, and environmental crimes that I had discovered through my position as Vice President of Operations for the family's manufacturing company, a role that had given me access to financial records, corporate communications, and operational data that revealed systematic violations of federal and state regulations that had been occurring for over a decade, while generating millions of dollars in additional profits through cost savings that were achieved by exploiting workers, contaminating local environments, and evading tax obligations that should have funded public services and infrastructure improvements in communities where our factories operated. The evidence that I had compiled included detailed documentation of unsafe working conditions that had resulted in numerous injuries and at least 3 deaths that had been covered up through bribes to safety inspectors and fraudulent accident reports that minimized company liability, while preventing families from receiving appropriate compensation for their losses and suffering. The environmental violations that I had documented included illegal disposal of toxic chemicals that had contaminated groundwater and soil in low-income neighborhoods, where residents lacked the resources and political influence necessary to challenge corporate behavior that was destroying their health and property values while generating substantial cost savings for our family's business operations that prioritized profit margins over environmental protection and community welfare. The tax evasion schemes that I had uncovered involved complex networks of offshore accounts and shell companies that had been created to hide income and assets from federal and state tax authorities, generating millions of dollars in unpaid tax obligations while simultaneously claiming charitable deductions for donations to foundations and nonprofit organizations that were actually controlled by family members and used to fund personal expenses and lifestyle enhancements rather than genuine charitable activities that would benefit the communities and causes that were supposedly being supported through these tax-advantaged giving strategies. The ultimatum that I had delivered to my family 6 months before the charity gala had given them a choice between implementing comprehensive reforms to address these illegal practices and accepting my resignation from all family business operations, along with my commitment to report their criminal activities to appropriate law enforcement agencies and regulatory authorities who had the power to investigate and prosecute the violations that I had documented through months of careful evidence gathering and documentation that would be sufficient to support criminal charges and civil penalties that could destroy their business empire and result in significant prison sentences for the family members who had participated in these illegal schemes. The response to my ultimatum had been swift and coordinated, involving not only my immediate termination from all business positions and revocation of access to company facilities and records, but also a systematic campaign to isolate me from family relationships and social connections that had been important sources of support and validation throughout my adult life when I had believed that my relatives shared my values and commitment to ethical behavior, even if we sometimes disagreed about specific strategies and priorities that might affect business operations and profitability. The erasure of my face from the family portrait had been the most symbolic and hurtful manifestation of their campaign to delete me from the family narrative and pretend that my contributions and very existence were insignificant enough to be forgotten and ignored by people who had once claimed to love and respect me as an important member of their family circle and business organization. The technical skill that had been required to remove my image so seamlessly and replace it with background details that maintained the artistic integrity of the original composition had involved hiring professional art restorers and paying substantial fees to ensure that the alteration would be undetectable to casual observers who might not remember exactly how the original portrait had been composed or who had been included in the family grouping. The charity gala where the altered portrait was being displayed had been planned as the family's most ambitious fundraising event ever, with goals of raising over $2 million for children's hospitals, while also celebrating the family's philanthropic legacy and community involvement that had supposedly been the foundation of our business success and social standing for over 4 generations of civic engagement and charitable giving that had earned recognition and respect from political leaders, business associates, and community organizations throughout our region. The guest list for the gala had included mayors and governors, federal judges and congressional representatives, corporate executives and university presidents, along with hundreds of other influential individuals whose presence and financial contributions would validate the family's importance and demonstrate their ability to attract support from the most powerful and respected members of our state's political and business establishment, who valued the relationships and access that came with association with wealthy philanthropists who could provide campaign contributions and business opportunities that were essential for maintaining political and economic influence. The program for the evening had been carefully choreographed to highlight the family's charitable achievements and community impact, while providing multiple opportunities for prominent guests to offer public praise and recognition for the generosity and leadership that had supposedly motivated decades of philanthropic activity and civic engagement that had benefited countless families and organizations throughout our region. The speeches and presentations that had been planned would create lasting records of the family's charitable legacy, while also generating positive media coverage and social media content that would enhance their reputation and influence within circles where charitable giving and community involvement were important measures of character and social responsibility. The moment when I stood up during the main presentation and walked to the podium that had been reserved for family members who would be speaking about our charitable work and community involvement was initially met with confused silence, as guests tried to understand why someone who had been excluded from the family portrait and who had not been listed on the program would be interrupting the carefully planned sequence of speakers and presentations that had been designed to create maximum impact and positive recognition for the family's philanthropic activities and community leadership. The microphone that I reached when I arrived at the podium provided the amplification necessary for my voice to carry clearly throughout the ballroom, where 300 influential guests were now focused on understanding what was happening and why the evening's program was being disrupted by someone whose presence had not been anticipated or authorized by the event organizers who had worked for months to create a flawless presentation that would enhance the family's reputation and generate substantial donations for the children's hospitals that were supposedly benefiting from this charitable initiative. The revelation that I began to share with the assembled guests started with my true identity and the reasons why my face had been erased from the family portrait that was hanging behind me, as I spoke to an audience that included many people who had known me for years as Elizabeth Morrison, but who had never suspected that my real name was actually Anna Catherine Kowalski, and that I was not a biological member of the Morrison family, but had been adopted as a teenager after my parents' deaths had left me orphaned and vulnerable to exploitation by people who had seen opportunities to use my intelligence and technical skills for their own benefit, while providing me with financial security and social status that had seemed like generous gifts at the time, but had actually been investments in creating a loyal employee and family member who would never question their methods or expose their criminal activities to outsiders who might interfere with their profitable but illegal business operations. The adoption story that I had been told and that had shaped my understanding of my relationship with the Morrison family had involved a carefully constructed narrative about their generous decision to provide a home and family for a bright young woman whose academic achievements and potential had impressed them enough to offer opportunities for education and career development that would have been impossible, given my humble background, as the daughter of Polish immigrants who had worked in factories and service jobs while saving money to provide better opportunities for their children, who would benefit from the sacrifices and determination that had characterized their approach to building a life in America. The truth about my adoption that I revealed to the shocked audience involved far more calculated and exploitative motivations, as the Morrison family had specifically sought out an orphaned teenager with exceptional mathematical and analytical abilities who could be trained to manage the complex financial schemes and record-keeping systems that were necessary for maintaining their tax evasion operations and money laundering activities while remaining loyal and silent about illegal practices that generated substantial profits, but required sophisticated technical expertise to implement and conceal from regulatory authorities and law enforcement agencies. The education and training that I had received throughout my teenage and young adult years had been specifically designed to develop the skills and knowledge that would make me valuable for managing the family's criminal enterprises while creating emotional and financial dependencies that would prevent me from questioning their methods or seeking alternative opportunities that might have led to exposure of their illegal activities and the sophisticated systems that had been created to hide income and assets from tax authorities and regulatory agencies that were responsible for enforcing federal and state laws governing corporate behavior and financial reporting. The business position that I had been given as Vice President of Operations had provided access to detailed information about the scope and sophistication of the Morrison family's criminal activities, while also making me complicit in their operations through my management of systems and processes that were essential for maintaining their illegal schemes and avoiding detection by authorities who might have been able to stop their criminal behavior and recover the millions of dollars in unpaid taxes and stolen wages that had been accumulated through decades of systematic violations of laws that were designed to protect workers, communities, and government revenues that should have funded public services and infrastructure improvements. The evidence that I had compiled during my years of managing these criminal operations included detailed financial records, recorded conversations, photographs of illegal activities, and documentation of bribes and other corrupt practices that would be sufficient to support federal criminal prosecutions under RICO statutes and other laws that provided severe penalties for organized criminal enterprises that had corrupted legitimate businesses and government officials while generating enormous profits through systematic violations of environmental protection laws, labor regulations, and tax obligations that were fundamental to the social contract that enabled democratic government and economic systems to function fairly and effectively. The federal investigation that I had already initiated through contacts with FBI agents and federal prosecutors who specialized in corporate crime and organized criminal enterprises had been ongoing for several months, while I continued to gather additional evidence and coordinate with law enforcement officials who were preparing criminal charges and civil enforcement actions that would result in the seizure of assets, criminal prosecutions, and civil penalties that would exceed the total value of the Morrison family's business empire and personal wealth that had been accumulated through decades of criminal activity, disguised as legitimate business operations and charitable philanthropy. The immediate reaction from the Morrison family members and their guests to my revelations was chaos and panic, as people realized that they were witnessing the exposure of criminal activities that could result in their own criminal liability as accomplices or conspirators who had benefited from illegal schemes while remaining willfully ignorant of the methods that had generated their profits and charitable donations that had enhanced their reputations and social standing within communities that had been harmed by the very activities that had funded their philanthropic gestures and community involvement. The arrests that began within hours of my public revelation included multiple family members and their business associates who had participated in the criminal enterprises that had been exposed through my testimony, and the evidence that I had provided to federal authorities who had been preparing criminal cases while waiting for the appropriate moment to execute arrest warrants and asset seizure orders that would prevent the destruction of evidence and the transfer of assets to offshore accounts that might have made recovery impossible for the victims who had been harmed by decades of criminal activity. The asset forfeiture proceedings that followed the arrest resulted in the seizure of hundreds of millions of dollars in real estate, financial accounts, business assets, and personal property that had been purchased with proceeds from criminal activities that violated federal and state laws governing corporate behavior, environmental protection, worker safety, and tax obligations that were fundamental to the functioning of democratic institutions and economic systems that depended on voluntary compliance with laws that protected public welfare and government revenues. The criminal trials that concluded these proceedings resulted in significant prison sentences for family members who had organized and participated in the criminal enterprises that had generated enormous profits, while causing substantial harm to workers, communities, and government programs that had been deprived of tax revenues that should have funded public services and infrastructure improvements that were essential for economic development and social welfare in regions where the Morrison family's businesses had operated for decades. The personal consequences of my decision to expose the Morrison family's criminal activities included the permanent loss of relationships with people who had raised me and provided me with opportunities and advantages that had shaped my adult life and career development, but also the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served for victims who had suffered injuries, health problems, and economic losses as a result of criminal behavior that had been hidden behind facades of respectability and charitable giving that had deceived communities and government officials for decades. The witness protection program that became necessary after my testimony and cooperation with federal authorities provided security and new identity that enabled me to rebuild my life based on authentic relationships and legitimate achievements, rather than the complicated and morally compromised circumstances that had characterized my years as a member of a family that had used their wealth and social status to exploit others, while maintaining carefully constructed public images as community leaders and philanthropists. Today, 5 years after I stood up at that charity gala and revealed my true name while exposing the criminal activities that had been funded by the very wealth that was being celebrated and honored through philanthropic recognition and community awards, I work as a forensic accountant specializing in corporate crime investigation and asset recovery for victims of white-collar criminal enterprises that use legitimate businesses and charitable organizations to hide illegal activities and exploit workers and communities while generating enormous profits for people who prioritize personal enrichment over social responsibility and legal compliance. The lesson that emerged from this experience is that families and organizations that prioritize loyalty and silence over honesty and justice create environments where criminal behavior can flourish and cause enormous harm to innocent people who deserve protection from exploitation and abuse by people who use their wealth and power to avoid accountability for actions that would result in severe consequences for anyone without access to expensive legal representation and political influence that can corrupt justice systems and regulatory processes. The decision to expose the Morrison family's criminal activities despite the personal costs and risks involved was motivated by recognition that my silence and complicity had contributed to ongoing harm to workers and communities who deserve protection from exploitation and environmental damage that was generating profits for people who had no regard for the welfare of others and who were using their charitable giving and community involvement to distract attention from criminal behavior that was causing real suffering and economic damage to vulnerable populations. Looking back on the moment when I discovered that my face had been erased from the family portrait and realized that my former relatives were willing to delete me from their history and narrative, rather than acknowledge the moral and legal obligations that should have governed their business practices and personal behavior, I understand that their act of erasure was actually a gift that freed me from loyalty obligations and emotional connections that had prevented me from taking action that was necessary for protecting victims and ensuring that justice was served for people who had been harmed by criminal enterprises that had operated with impunity for decades. Was I wrong to expose the criminal activities of people who had adopted and raised me, even though their behavior was causing harm to innocent workers and communities who deserved protection from exploitation and environmental damage? Should family loyalty take precedence over legal and moral obligations to report criminal behavior that was generating enormous profits while causing real suffering to vulnerable populations? Would you have made the same choice to reveal criminal activities at a public charity event, or should such information have been provided to authorities through private channels that would have protected the reputations of people who might not have been directly involved in illegal schemes? Sometimes the most important decisions require choosing justice and protection of innocent victims over family loyalty and personal relationships that have been built on foundations of criminal behavior and moral compromise that ultimately serve no one's genuine long-term interests and that prevent authentic relationships and legitimate success that can only exist when people and organizations operate within legal and ethical boundaries that protect human welfare and social justice.